So what I do with my approach to the body is I say, okay, so at some point the human genome was forged. Whatever we can call the human genome, at whatever point we can call it that. I believe in the evolutionary record we're about 100 to 200,000 years old as a species, if you really want to nail it down. And what happened again with the advent of civilization, with the advent of consciousness, is that we started to, amalgamate things. We started to group things together. So we started, and you correct me if I'm wrong, to live in a way that we had to adapt to because that wasn't what was being done when our genome was forged.
Right.
So from a physical standpoint, I always say if we look back to what forged the genome and what type of species we were when the genome was formed, which is hunter-gatherer. There's no argument to that. The machinery hasn't changed. Okay, so it's still the same type of machinery. We're still doing the same types of things. So if you want to know how to keep an articulation healthy, then the answer would be to find out how it was forged and what our genome expects of us. Okay, so let's just start with that. Now, for physical evolution, I have the argument that consciousness made it that a lot of the natural selective pressures have been eliminated, right? Like you go to the grocery store and it's not a matter of I have to kill a rabbit. It's a matter of what flavor fucking chocolate bar do I have to choose from.
Right.
And there's like 1,700 of them. And then there's this dichotomy that I am a conscious being and the consciousness of me is what's fucking this up because there's too many choices. I'm going to get to my question in a second, Rob. So then I think to myself, well, what about nutritional evolution? What about chemical evolution? And I have this notion that I don't think that chemical evolution was halted as quickly as physical evolution. Do you have anything to say? So in other words, chemical evolution seems to keep going on. My wife, for example, can't eat dairy, right? She doesn't have the enzyme, lactase or whatever to process this food. And I do, and I'm quite happy eating it, and she can't. So there's something about the ongoing evolution of chemistry which makes it different between you and me. Am I right with nutrition? Is this something you agree with?
Yeah, I do, and it's interesting. Richard Wrangham, who's a professor of evolutionary biology at Harvard, he wrote a book, Catching Fire, and it's interesting that human technology has actually influenced the evolutionary process. Like you would make the case that our ability to process food to some degree, and that's just stone tools and being able to butcher an animal, that opens up a really different world for us being able to consume foods or making fire and being able to cook foods. And so it's that expensive tissue hypothesis that the ability to both select for very nutrient dense foods and then also make them more digestible. Our guts tended to shrink relative to previous iterations of humanity, and our brains grew. And there's pushback about whether or not that's a 100% airtight case, but it's interesting that you have the very existence of intelligence now is arguably influencing evolution. There's a really, I think, interesting example of this. The Swidden cultures within Africa, when they started doing the slash and burn process of clearing land and then planting crops, what it did is it opened up this huge reservoir for mosquitoes that had been a vector in humanity's existence forever, but it just dramatically expanded the number of these critters that people were living around. And people started living in kind of grass huts in proximity to these critters, and the mosquitoes carry malaria. And this malaria was so damaging to people that there was one of the fastest, most profound genetic adaptations in history, which is the development of sickle cell anemia. And folks that are heterozygous with sickle cell anemia, they've got a little bit of sickling of the red blood cells, and that prevents the malaria, from getting set up in there. People who get homozygous genes, they die typically in their youth. So there's a 25% fatality rate with this disease, but it was a sufficient evolutionary win that it became one of the fastest, most rapid, genetic alterations that we've ever seen in human history. And because the infectious disease impact of malaria was so profound. And now, interestingly, folks who live in the United States and Canada, Europe, who have that sickle cell anemia characteristics, that trait is disappearing at a very rapid rate because there's no longer that selection pressure kind of pushing for it. So I think that, at a genetic level, things can change really rapidly. And then some of what's going on too is this epigenetic change.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't even need to change the genes per se, but just how they're turned on or off. And I think back to your point around like the lactase persistence and whatnot, sometimes that's just whether or not a gene gets methylated or not methylated and leaves it either in the on or off function. And that is where it's almost kind of, in my mind, like this pseudo Lamarckian genetics, where like you can have more fine tuning in the more immediate state. You don't need to actually change genetic codes to be able to get this really profound change, because we're just altering the way that these things get turned on and off. And so I think that it really changes that picture of what evolution looks like for human beings. And it actually throwing a rock into kind of this classic paleo diet kind of perspective, it also makes the case that depending on what the circumstances are, we don't, a big foundation of, say, like what Lauren Cordain said to support the paleo diet is that our genes are largely the same as what our hunter-gatherer ancestors were. That's true, and there's probably some lessons to take from that. But then when we look at epigenetic changes, when we look at gut microbiome changes, which also alter the genes and alter the epigenetics, then we have these other factors that can really, play into different dietary situations. Some people thriving on a particular diet while other people might struggle with it. But those aren't even at the genetic level, they're more at the epigenetic level.